Sometimes, when we execute operations that can fail, we want to do some sort of error recovery, which consists in executing a fallback operation when an error occurs. So if we execute an operation that fails and returns a left E1, we might want to execute a fallback operation that returns another either. Let's see an actual example. Let's say that we have a login page in which the user can log in using their email or their phone number. We want to define a function, validateLoginName, which takes the input entered by the user and validates whether it is a valid email or phone number. So our validateLoginName function should take the entered login name, which is a string, and return either some validation error or a valid email or phone number. First, let's write a validateEmail function that validates if the given string is a valid email. We can define it using either from predicate, which works in a similar way to option from predicate. It takes as first argument a predicate function, which in our case is a function that takes a maybe email string and returns whether that string matches an email regex. If this predicate function returns true, we have an either right. If, on the other hand, it returns false, we have an either left, so we need to pass a second argument, which is a function that maps the invalid email to an error. This could be any arbitrary error object, but for simplicity, in this case we will return a simple error code. So we check if the invalid email contains an @ sign, and if so, we return malformed email, otherwise not an email. So if we look at the type of validate email, we see that it is a function that takes a string and returns either malformed email or not an email in the left case, and a string with a valid email in the right case. Going back to the validateLoginName function, the first thing we want to do is to validate if the entered login name is a valid email, which we can do by piping it into validateEmail. And the result that we get back is either malformed email or not an email in the left case, and a string with a valid email in the right case. Now, if we have a left with the not an email error, we want to try to recover from this error by validating the login name as a phone number. We can define validate phone number in a similar way to validate email using either from predicate. We pass as first argument a predicate function which takes a maybe phone number string and returns whether this string matches a phone number regex. If this predicate function returns true, we have an either right. Otherwise, we have an either left. So we pass as second argument a function that maps the invalid phone number to an error. In this case, we simply return invalid phone number. Notice that TypeScript infers a string in the left case rather than the string literal. We can fix this by adding sconst to invalid phone number. So the type of validate phone number is a function that takes a string and returns either invalid phone number or a string with a valid phone number. Returning back to validateLoginName, how can we actually try to recover from the error? That is, how can we perform a fallback validation, like validate phone number, only when we have a left with the not an email error? This is where either or else comes in. Either or else takes a fallback function that is executed only when the received either is a left. This function takes the error and returns another either. Therefore, the fallback operation can still fail. So going back to validateLoginName, we can perform validate phone number as a fallback validation by using orElse. So we check if the error is not an email, and if so, we call validate phone number. Otherwise, we return a left with the same error, that is malformed email. The result that we get back at this point is either malformed email or invalid phone number in the left case, and a string with a valid email or phone number in the right case. Notice that returning a simple string in the right case is not ideal because it is not clear if it is a valid email or phone number. It would be better to return objects with a type property. So we can define an email type, which is a simple object that has a type and a value property, and have validateEmail return an email object instead of a simple string by doing function composition with flow, where we first create an either and then map its right value, which is an email string, into an email object. Similarly, we can define a phone number type as a simple object with a type and a value, and have validate phone number return a phone number object instead of a simple string by doing function composition with flow, where we first create an either and then map its right value, which is a phone number string, into a phone number object. Returning back to validateLoginName, we now get an email object from validateEmail. And notice that we have a TypeScript error. Type phone number is not assignable to type email. This is because the either returned by orElse should have a write value with the same type as the original either. But in this case, the type of the write value has diverged since it is a phone number object rather than an email object. This can be easily fixed by using orElseW, where the W stands for widening to indicate that we are widening the type of the write value, that is, making it a union. So we now get email or phone number as the write value, which is much better than a simple string. To get a better understanding of how this works, let's see what actually happens step by step when we call validateLoginName with a valid email. First, we pipe loginName into validateEmail. Since this is a valid email, we get back a write with an email object. We then pipe that into orElseW, which simply returns back the received write since it's not a left. And this is the final output that our function returns. Let's also see what happens when we call validateLoginName with a valid phone number. So we pipe loginName into validateEmail. Since it does not represent an email, we get back a left with a not an email error. Then we pipe that left into orElseW, which this time calls the fallback function. Since the error is equal to not an email, it calls validatePhoneNumber, which returns a write with a phone number object, since it received a valid phone number. And this is the final output of our function. Next, let's see what happens when we call validateLoginName with a malformed email. Again, we pipe loginName into validateEmail. Since it represents a malformed email, we get back a left with a malformed email error. Then we pipe that left into orElseW, which calls the fallback function. Since the error is not equal to not an email, it returns back a left with the same error, that is malformed email, and this is the final output. Lastly, let's see what happens when we call validateLoginName with an invalid phone number. So we pipe loginName into validateEmail. Since it does not represent an email, we get back a left with a not an email error. Then we pipe that left into orElseW, which calls the fallback function. Since the error is equal to not an email, it calls validatePhoneNumber, which this time returns a left with an invalid phone number error since it received an invalid phone number, and this is the final result. As a last note, if instead of returning error codes in our utils, we return error objects with a type property, we might face some TypeScript errors. So if we define malformed email and not an email as objects with a type and an error property, and we return them as errors in the validateEmail util instead of the simple error codes that we had before, and then we do the same for validatePhoneNumber, so we define invalid phone number as an object with a type and an error property, and we return it as error in the validatePhoneNumber util instead of the error code, we will see a TypeScript error in the function passed to orElseW in validateLoginName, which is types of property type are incompatible. Type malformed email is not assignable to type invalid phone number. This seems to be because TypeScript is not able to properly infer a union type for the left case, which should be invalid phone number or malformed email. One way to fix this is to manually annotate the return type of the function passed to orElseW, which in this case is either invalid phone number or malformed email in the left case and a phone number object in the right case. So keep this in mind.